Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're looking at something quite extraordinary, really. A geopolitical moment. Just so full of contradiction, so much irony, it almost feels like a snapshot of, well, our current world.
It really does. We're examining this convergence, this shared international political theater, you could call it, that's somehow both incredibly personal for the figures involved and yet globally significant.
Yeah, and it's a story where maybe the punchline actually hides something rather deeper, maybe even a blueprint for peace.
That's exactly the angle. Our
Well,
source material today walks us through this, well, frankly, bizarre scenario, a geopolitical alignment you just wouldn't expect
between who?
between two leaders locked in a bitter war, Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelenskyy.
Right, sworn enemies?
Exactly. And they suddenly found common ground,
Right.
publicly, sharing mutual disappointment over something quite specific.
Okay, I have to ask, what could possibly unite them?
The fact that Donald Trump did not win the 2025 Nobel Peace Prize.
Wow, okay. Just saying that sentence out loud. It's a lot. Layers upon layers of irony there.
It absolutely is. And that's our mission today, really, to get past the immediate head-scratching absurdity of it all.
Right, to unpack it.
Yeah, to dissect what this shared outrage actually tells us. What does it reveal about the state of the Ukraine war, the real motivations of these leaders, and maybe most importantly, whether this whole quest for validation, for, a medal, could it actually become some strange, twisted path towards diplomacy, maybe even a resolution?
It's a fascinating premise. So let's set the scene. Ground zero is the Nobel Prize announcement itself, October 11th, 2025.
That's right. The committee, doing its thing, very formal, very impartial, announces a Peace Prize winner.
And it wasn't Trump?
No, it was Venezuelan opposition leader María Corina Machado. Honored, the committee said, for her sustained and courageous efforts to restore democracy in Venezuela. A very worthy cause, of course.
Of course. But the reaction elsewhere.
Well, that decision, while, perfectly defensible based on the prize criteria, sent immediate shockwaves, especially, as you mentioned, in Washington, D.C. and across, well, what the sources call Trump world.
It wasn't just disappointment then.
Oh, no, far beyond that. It was described as outrage, and it was rooted in this long-held expectation. The sources make it clear there was a very visible campaign building up to this.
A campaign for Trump to win.
Yes, a conviction, really, that his, and I'm quoting the sentiment here, unparalleled global peace achievements made him the obvious choice, the only choice, maybe, in their eyes.
The expectation was really that high, palpable, you might say.
Absolutely. It wasn't just wishful thinking. It taps into something deeper, this long-standing desire he seems to have for that specific validation, the Nobel Peace Prize.
Okay, so that sets up the next part perfectly. Let's dig into that history. Section 2, Trump's quest for the Nobel and this latest snub. Because you're right, to understand the intensity of the reaction, we need to grasp his relationship with this award.
Exactly. The source material, it frames it really well. As a quest, yes, or even like the relationship of a jilted lover. That phrase really stuck out.
Stilted lover. That implies a real sense of entitlement, almost.
I think that's fair. He's been chasing this particular seal of approval, the ultimate institutional nod, for years.
Where did it really start? Can we trace it back?
We can. The analysis suggests the intensity really ramped up around that 2018 meeting with Kim Jong-un in North Korea. That was groundbreaking, undeniably.
Right, the Singapore summit.
Yes. And at that moment, the idea of a prize probably felt incredibly close, tangible. But over the years, as it didn't materialize, that desire seems to have, hardened into a perceived right, almost. A key part of the legacy he wanted, which he felt was being unfairly withheld by the global establishment.
And he wasn't quiet about feeling a snub before, was he?
Not at all. He often voiced his resentment about the process. He had a very specific theory about the committee's leanings.
What was that?
He lamented, and this is a direct quote highlighted in the analysis, that the committee, quote, don't give it to conservatives. They give it to people who start wars, not stop them, end quote.
Wow. Okay, that quote is doing a lot of work there.
It really is, because it frames the entire narrative his supporters built around this 2025 snub. For them, the committee isn't objective. It's inherently biased.
So the award isn't about peace, it's about politics, in that view.
Precisely. So this latest rejection, it wasn't seen as a fair assessment of his diplomatic record or lack thereof. It was just more proof of this perceived conspiracy against him, against conservatives.
And the sources mention preparation. That makes the rejection even more, personal, doesn't it? If you're already measuring the curtain, so to speak.
Exactly. The level of preparation described makes the sting much sharper. We learn, reportedly, that he had actually cleared a prominent spot on his mantelpiece at Mar-a-Lago, specifically for the Nobel medal.
Seriously, cleared a spot.
That's what the reporting indicates. And, maybe even more telling, he and his team had apparently already started workshopping the acceptance speech.
No kidding. Did they have a title?
Tentatively, yes. The working title was reportedly, "Nobody has ever deserved it more."
Oh, okay. That says it all, really.
It does. When you prepare to that degree, the disappointment isn't just a political loss. It becomes a deep personal grievance, a major snub.
Which then fuels the reaction, the official indignation from his supporters from the White House. What was the main line of attack against the Nobel Committee?
The reaction was very quick. The core accusation was that the committee was choosing politics over peace. That was the phrase used.
Choosing politics over peace.
Yes. It was framed as an attack, an institutional flight against, his specific brand of foreign policy. The argument was basically, if you care about actual practical de-escalation, about stopping conflicts, then Trump's efforts, real or perceived, should have been the priority, not, someone focused on internal democratic reform in just one country.
It's a direct challenge to the committee's judgment and priorities. How did the Nobel Committee respond to this very public, very political pressure?
Well, as you might expect, with that sort of Nordic reserve, the chair, Jürgen Wattenweidnes, issued a statement. It was precise, diplomatic, but also incredibly sharp, if you read between the lines.
What did he say?
He stated that the award recognizes, quote, sustained contributions to peace, not seasonal publicity tours.
Ouch. Seasonal publicity tours, that's direct.
It's a masterclass in polite but firm rebuttal, isn't it?
So if we translate that diplomatic language into, plain English, what's the core message there?
The expert analysis in our sources boil it down quite effectively, I thought. The translation is essentially, tweeting about peace doesn't count as peacemaking.
Right. That's blunt.
It is. The committee is drawing a very clear line. They're saying there's a difference between highly visible, maybe transactional events like summits, photo ops, short-term deals, and the really hard, sustained, often unglamorous work, the institution building, the structural changes, the long-term diplomacy that they believe genuinely earns a peace prize.
So they saw the campaign for his Nobel as more about performance, more temporary.
That seems to be the implication, that it lacked the deep, sustained impact they look for. It was perceived, perhaps, as being more about the campaign itself than about lasting peace.
Okay. So the stage is perfectly set now. Huge expectations, very public preparation, a deeply felt personal snub, and this official rebuttal dismissing the efforts as, well, superficial. And now we bring in the most unexpected characters.
Absolutely. Let's move into Section 3. This is where things get, as you said, head-spinning. The moment when these two wartime adversaries, Putin and Zelenskyy, step up. Not to condemn Trump, but to champion his Nobel cause after he lost. Let's start with Vladimir Putin. What exactly did he say, and what was the tone? His comments were, well, pure political performance art. Dripping with sarcasm, you could say. He started by lamenting that the Nobel Prize itself had, quote, lost its meaning.
Okay, so positioning himself as sort of a disappointed observer of Western decline.
Exactly. Immediately aligning himself with Trump's own narrative that these Western institutions are biased or broken. It's a classic move.
But he didn't just complain generally, did he? He specifically mentioned Trump.
Oh, yes. And this is where the irony just goes off the charts. Putin explicitly credited Donald Trump, with, quote, doing more for global stability than most of those who win it.
More for global stability. Coming from Putin.
Right. And then he delivered the real zinger. He added, almost as an aside, perhaps next time they should give it to someone who actually prevents wars.
Hold on, I need to pause there. This is Vladimir Putin saying this. While prosecuting the largest land war in Europe since World War II, how does the analysis explain him delivering that line with a straight face?
The analysis suggests it wasn't about self-awareness at all. The hypocrisy is the point, almost. It wasn't aimed at introspection. It was aimed squarely at the Western liberal order.
As a weapon.
Precisely.
Yeah.
By praising Trump, the ultimate outsider, Putin uses him like a political tool. A cudgel, as the source puts it, to try and delegitimize the very Western structures, the Nobel Committee, NATO, the Washington Consensus that are opposing him. It's incredibly cynical, low-cost information warfare.
Yeah.
With huge potential impact.
Okay. Just when you think the irony levels have peaked, the source material brings in Volodymyr Zelenskyy, the leader of the country being invaded. What on earth was his reaction to Trump not winning the prize?
His comments were, in some ways, even more stunning than Putin's. because they weren't sarcastic. They were apparently quite sympathetic.
Sympathetic. Zelenskyy towards Trump on this.
Yes. Zelenskyy stated quite clearly, according to the reports, that Trump deserved recognition for, quote, trying to broker peace.
Deserve recognition. That's huge coming from him, especially given Trump's rhetoric about the war sometimes.
Absolutely huge. And he didn't stop there. He also reiterated a promise that Kyiv had apparently made previously.
What was that promise? Let's make sure we nail down the context here.
He reaffirmed that if Trump could actually end the war, and that's a massive if, of course, then, quote, Ukraine would support his nomination.
Ukraine would support Trump's Nobel nomination if he ends the war, even while Trump is publicly saying things like Ukraine should just cut a deal with Russia, a deal many Ukrainians see as unacceptable surrender.
Exactly. That's the context that makes Zelensky's statement such a high-stakes, almost paradoxical gamble. He's offering this validation while Trump is suggesting pathways many in Kyiv would find disastrous.
So let's just recap this moment. We have the man arguably most responsible for the war, Putin, and the man leading the defense against it, Zelenskyy, both essentially agreeing that Donald Trump, the former reality TV star, should have won the Nobel Peace Prize.
It's irony overload. You couldn't make it up.
Did any commentators capture this absurdity?
Oh, yes. One pundit quoted in the material quipped that the world had finally achieved peace on Earth, at least about who didn't win peace.
That's good. A shared grievance unites the unlikeliest pair.
Right. And another quote really summarized the sheer bizarreness of the alignment. We've reached the point where the world's most famous warmonger and the world's most beleaguered wartime president are on the same side for a reality TV star who wanted a medal. It just captures the surreal nature of it all.
And the sources dig into Putin's calculation again here, beyond just general cynicism.
Yes. They note the contradiction in his own stance. Apparently, he had previously called Zelensky's willingness to nominate Trump ridiculous, but now he was endorsing Trump's supposedly great peace instincts.
So total inconsistency.
Completely. The analogy uses like two rivals on a reality TV show. They also detest each other, but they both strategically vote for the same outsider contestant. Why? Because they know the contestant winning messes up the entire game, undermines the show's structure, which they both, for different reasons, resent.
It really underscores that in this kind of high-stakes geopolitics, pure self-interest and maneuvering just completely trump ideology, doesn't it?
It seems to, yes. Consistency and principle take a backseat to perceived advantage.
Okay, this shared sentiment, this frankly bizarre alliance, it clearly isn't just random noise, it's strategic. That leads us nicely into Section 4, digging into the strategy, the ego, and the political math behind all this. Let's start with Zelenskyy. Was his sympathy for Trump genuine, or was it pure calculation?
The analysis leans very heavily towards strategic calculation, almost entirely. For Kyiv, at this moment, Trump's very public disappointment wasn't a time for genuine empathy. It was a window of opportunity.
An opportunity for what?
An opportunity to leverage Trump's most obvious vulnerability, his massive ego, and that intense desire for recognition, specifically the Nobel. The goal, quite transparently, is to use this vulnerability to nudge him, maybe even push him, back towards active engagement in Ukraine diplomacy, but on terms that might be more favorable to Kyiv.
So what's the concrete objective? What does Kyiv hope to gain by publicly validating Trump's Nobel ambitions?
It seems to be twofold, and both objectives are incredibly practical, very down to earth. First, and most obviously, they need to secure the continued flow of U.S. military aid. That aid is absolutely vital, and it's constantly subject to the shifting political winds in Washington, especially with Trump potentially returning to power.
Right. Keep the weapons coming.
Exactly. Second, and maybe almost as important, they want to reduce the negative pressure from Trump himself. Fewer critical tweets, fewer public demands to just cut a deal, less impatience with the conflict's duration and cost. They want to manage him, essentially.
So Zelenskyy is dangling the ultimate carrot. The one prize Trump seems to want above all others, that phrase, if he secures peace, we will back him. It's less an offer and more direct challenge, isn't it?
That's a great way to put it. It's basically saying, you claim you're the ultimate deal maker. Prove it. End this war in a way we can live with, and you get your medal. You get the glory.
It's pure transactional diplomacy, playing directly to the former president's primary motivation, his own legacy and recognition.
Precisely. It's an attempt to harness that powerful engine for Ukraine's benefit.
Now let's flip back to Putin's irony. Why praise Trump, a Western leader he often spars with? Is it just to sow discord? Or is there something deeper tactically?
There's definitely a deeper tactical layer beyond just general cynicism or sarcasm. When Putin endorses Trump's supposed peace instincts, he accomplishes several things at once.
Okay, like what?
Well, first, as we discussed, he undermines the legitimacy of the Nobel Committee and aligns himself with that anti-establishment sentiment Trump champions. That's useful. But maybe more importantly, he subtly drives a wedge.
A wedge between who?
Between the U.S., potentially under Trump, and its traditional European allies. He's suggesting that the established Western foreign policy approach, the consensus view, is flawed, that it's failing, and that maybe only an outsider, someone disruptive like Trump, actually holds the key to real peace.
So it paints the mainstream Western approach as ineffective and Trump as the unlikely necessary alternative, while also making Putin look like the one recognizing this truth.
Exactly. It's designed to destabilize that Western consensus, create uncertainty, and position himself, ironically, as a voice of reason, pointing out the West's alleged hypocrisy or failures. A very sophisticated, low-risk, high-reward diplomatic maneuver.
And the global reactions really seem to capture this whole weird dynamic, didn't they? What were some of the international takes?
The sources highlighted some great commentary. A French columnist, for instance, pointed out the core irony. Putin and Zelenskyy finally agree about an American. Miracles do exist. Captures it perfectly.
And the Norwegian paper, the home country of the Nobel Peace Prize.
Yes. Norway's main newspaper, Aftenposten, had a headline that was just spot on. From war to wine. Rivals unite over Nobel snub.
From war to wine, that's brutally accurate.
It really nails a move, doesn't it?
And what was the consensus in Washington, according to the commentary?
It was seen as, quote, peak 2025. Just the perfect illustration of the bizarre state of global politics. Summing up the idea that only Donald Trump could possibly unite his fiercest enemies against him, but for completely different, entirely self-serving reasons.
It really highlights the unique role he plays on the world stage, which brings us to a really crucial analytical point the sources make. The power of ego in all of this.
Yes, this is where the analysis pivots from just observing the absurdity to seeing a potential, albeit unconventional, path forward. The synthesis offered is that ego, far from always being a hindrance, is actually a critical component in diplomacy.
How so?
The analysis points out that almost every major peace deal you can think of in recent history, Camp David, between Egypt and Israel, the Oslo Accords for Israel and Palestine, even the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, involve leaders with immense egos. Significant personal ambition.
So leaders sign these deals not just for peace itself, but for their place in history, for the legacy.
That's a huge part of it. The tangible, lasting benefit to their personal legacy is often a powerful motivator, alongside the genuine desire for peace. Abstract ideals are important, but the promise of historical greatness, of personal vindication, is often what gets leaders to take the final, difficult steps.
Which means Trump's enormous ego, this almost obsessive drive for the Nobel, it might not be just a personality quirk. It could actually make him useful, a highly motivated broker.
That's the counterintuitive argument being made, because he's not primarily driven by ideology or even maybe traditional national interest in this case. He's chasing the headline. He's chasing the medal. And that intense, focused desire could, theoretically, make him incredibly motivated to actually close a deal if he believes he will get the credit.
So the source material actually proposes a strategic concept based on this.
Yes. It introduces something termed the Trump Accord. And the key here is that this isn't presented as some pie-in-the-sky idealistic dream. It's framed as hard-nosed, pragmatic geopolitics.
The Trump Accord. What's the core idea?
It posits that peace in Ukraine is achievable, but perhaps only by aligning three fundamentally conflicting sets of interests into one big, messy, grand bargain.
Okay, let's break down those three conflicting interests. What needs to align for this Trump Accord to work?
All right, the three pillars are: first, Trump's Nobel Prize. That's his non-negotiable, the ultimate personal goal driving his potential involvement.
Pillar 1, Trump's ego and legacy.
Exactly. Second, Putin's objectives. Primarily sanctions relief, but also some form of global validation, a narrative victory.
Right.
A face-saving way out of the conflict that allows him to claim he achieved his goals, particularly protecting Russian-speaking populations.
Pillar 2, Putin's exit strategy and validation.
Right. And third, Zelensky's needs. Achieving peace, yes, but peace with dignity. Preserving Ukrainian sovereignty as much as possible, ensuring security guarantees, and crucially, securing massive international support for reconstruction.
Pillar 3, Ukraine's survival, sovereignty, and rebuilding.
Precisely. The Trump Accord concept suggests that the sheer force of Trump's ego, his desire for the Nobel, could be the engine powerful enough to pull these other two seemingly irreconcilable sets of interests into alignment. Ego becomes the lubricant for the deal, replacing ideological purity or mutual trust as the driving force.
That's a pretty staggering way to reframe the potential for peace. It makes the solution hinge on a complex negotiation of vanity, leverage, and national interest, utterly pragmatic.
And that pragmatism is key as we move into the next section. We've gone from the political theater, the Nobel drama, to this idea of the Trump Accord. Now, let's use that insight to transition into Section V, which details the actual framework for peace that emerges from these discussions. A bold, comprehensive plan.
Okay, so this isn't just theory anymore. This is about the nuts and bolts of a potential deal.
Exactly. And this transition is vital because it forces us, and the leaders involved, to confront the practical, likely very painful concessions required from everyone. The core idea, the sort of revolutionary concept underpinning this peace proposal, is that peace is possible. But only if both sides find the political courage to abandon their maximalist demands, their absolute victory conditions.
And the current state of the war, the reality on the ground, seems to demand that kind of pragmatism, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. The source material is quite blunt about the current situation being a brutal war of attrition. A stalemate, essentially.
Fueled by what?
Fueled largely by pride, by sunk costs, by inertia on both sides. The analysis stresses that this isn't actually an unsolvable military problem in the long run. It's just that the cost of solving it militarily is becoming unbearable for everyone.
How so?
Well, Russia simply cannot achieve total victory, cannot occupy all of Ukraine without truly catastrophic losses, both military and economic, that could risk the stability of the regime itself. They can't afford to win in that sense.
And Ukraine.
Conversely, Ukraine likely cannot reclaim every single inch of territory lost since 2014 without perpetual, massive, and financially draining support from the West. And that support, as we see, is becoming increasingly politically fragile in key countries like the U.S.
So the stalemate is real, and the costs are mounting. Compromise isn't just desirable, it's becoming necessary.
That's the core argument, which leads to the first major and probably most difficult requirement of this framework, what the sources call Zelensky's required courageous step.
Okay, what massive concession is being asked of Kyiv?
The framework proposes that Kyiv must take the initiative, specifically by proposing a constitutional amendment to formally remove the clause about seeking NATO membership.
Wow. Removing the NATO aspiration from the Constitution, that's been a cornerstone of Ukrainian policy for years.
It has, and that's why it's framed as the ultimate political olive branch to Moscow. The analysis concludes quite starkly that Ukraine's explicit, constitutionally mandated pursuit of NATO membership has become the war's single most dangerous flashpoint. It's the justification Moscow constantly uses for its security concerns, however legitimate one thinks those are.
So removing it is designed to take away Putin's core justification for the conflict. Strike at the root cause, so to speak.
That's the strategic logic behind it. A massive upfront concession designed to fundamentally change the negotiating landscape.
But politically, for Zelenskyy, who's rallied his nation around resisting Russia and integrating with the West, wouldn't proposing this be incredibly risky, almost political suicide? How does the framework account for that internal political danger?
That's a critical question, and the framework addresses it directly with a sort of integrated political strategy. It suggests that to give this huge pivot towards peace legitimacy, Zelenskyy wouldn't just announce it. He would immediately call for new, snap presidential elections.
New elections in the middle of this.
Yeah.
Why?
The goal is twofold. First, it allows him, or any other candidate running on a peace platform, to gain a fresh democratic mandate, specifically for this difficult peace agenda. It shifts the ownership of the NATO concession from just one leader to the expressed will of the Ukrainian people in an election.
So it becomes a democratic choice, not just a leader's decree.
Exactly. Second, calling elections allows him to pivot the national conversation away from purely wartime unity and towards the very hard choices needed for post-war survival, reconstruction, and future security arrangements outside of NATO. It reframes the national project.
That's clever. Tying the painful concession directly to democratic renewal. Okay, so that's the big political move. What about stopping the actual fighting? The military side, the ceasefire mechanism.
The plan here focuses on creating a substantial, verifiable buffer zone to physically separate the armies. It calls for a mutual ceasefire, obviously, followed by the withdrawal of all troops at least 50 miles behind the currently disputed borders.
50 miles, that's a significant distance. Why that specific number?
The technical significance is that 50 miles pushes both sides' forces, generally outside the range of standard artillery systems and most short-range rockets. It dramatically reduces the ability for immediate re-engagement or accidental escalation. It creates real military space, which also has a psychological impact, stabilizing the front line.
Okay, a 50-mile deep buffer zone. But the question that always tanks these plans, who enforces it? Who patrols that zone to make sure both sides stick to the deal?
This is where the framework brings in that element of multipolar diplomacy we touched on earlier. The proposal is for the buffer zone to be patrolled by a neutral United Nations peacekeeping force.
UN peacekeepers. Okay,
Yeah.
but the composition of that force is usually contentious.
Extremely. And that's why the sources are very specific here. They argue this force must be drawn primarily from nations that have proven non-aligned credibility, countries respected by, or at least acceptable to, both Kyiv and Moscow.
And they name specific countries.
They do. They specifically mention India and Nepal.
India and Nepal. Why them? Why not, say, Finland or Austria, traditional neutral European states? Or African nations?
The rationale is quite specific and, I think, quite shrewd. Both India and Nepal have incredibly deep, long-standing traditions of contributing troops to difficult UN peacekeeping missions all over the world. Think Congo, Lebanon, South Sudan. They have decades of experience and a reputation for professionalism and, crucially, impartiality on the ground.
Okay, experience matters. What else?
More importantly, perhaps, is their geopolitical standing. Both maintain genuinely non-aligned foreign policies. India especially has complex but significant relationships with both Russia, historically a major arms supplier, and the West, particularly the US and Europe, economically. This unique positioning makes them potentially acceptable to Moscow, which would almost certainly veto any peacekeeping force led by NATO members or countries seen as too closely aligned with the West.
So using troops from these major global South nations isn't just symbolic.
It's highly symbolic, yes, signaling a move away from a purely US-Russia or East-West dynamic, but it's also intensely practical. It increases the likelihood of the peacekeeping force actually being approved and deployed because it addresses Moscow's likely objections head-on. It adds a layer of multipolar credibility that a Western-led force simply couldn't achieve in this context.
That detail, leveraging specific non-aligned nations like India and Nepal, really adds a layer of sophisticated realism to the framework, doesn't it? Shows they've thought through the likely sticking points.
Absolutely. And that realism continues as we move into Section 6, which tackles arguably the thorniest issue of all, the future status of the occupied territories. This involves the referendum mechanism.
Right. Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, and critically Crimea. These are the emotional and legal heart of the conflict for both sides. How does the plan propose to resolve their status?
Through direct democracy, essentially. The framework calls for internationally monitored referenda to be held in every single one of these disputed regions. No exceptions.
A referendum in each region. On what question?
This is crucial. To ensure it's a genuine expression of self-determination and not just a binary, potentially polarizing choice, the citizens in each region would be offered 3 distinct binding choices.
3 choices. Okay, what are they?
The options are structured to reflect the complex realities and identities on the ground.
Remain within a federal Ukraine. But critically, this comes with pre-agreed, constitutionally guaranteed protections for language rights, cultural autonomy, and significant powers of local governance. So staying in Ukraine, but with enhanced autonomy.
Okay, option 1. Federal Ukraine with guarantees. What's option 2?
Option 2, form independent states. These regions could choose full sovereignty, becoming independent nations, perhaps within some kind of loose confederation structure with each other, or even with neighbors. This offers a path to statehood without necessarily joining Russia immediately. It creates a potentially neutral buffer.
Option 2, independence. And option 3.
Option 3, join the Russian Federation. This is obviously the outcome Moscow desires for at least some regions. But, crucially, this choice could only be made under internationally recognized and properly monitored conditions. It couldn't be a repeat of the unilateral, widely condemned annexations we saw earlier. It would have to be a legitimate, observed process.
3 distinct choices. That's ambitious. But the whole thing hinges on legitimacy, doesn't it? Given the history of disputed elections and referendums in that part of the world, how can anyone trust the results?
The framework is absolutely clear on this. The entire process, voter registration, campaigning, the voting itself, and the count, must be under strict UN supervision. There would need to be transparent, verified voter rolls, guaranteed access for independent international observers from credible organizations, and security for voters.
And the results? What if Moscow or Kiev doesn't like the outcome in a particular region?
This is the linchpin. The plan stipulates that the results, whatever they are, in each region, must be binding on both Kiev and Moscow. They have to agree beforehand to accept the democratic verdict of the people living in those territories, even if it goes against their preferred outcome.
That's a huge commitment, forcing them to accept the people's will over their own strategic goals.
It is. But the argument is that this is the only truly legitimate way to resolve disputes that are fundamentally about identity, history, and self-determination. It takes the decision away from the generals and the politicians in the capitals and gives it, finally, to the people directly affected.
So, for you listening, the core idea here is that these referenda, if conducted credibly, offer a path to diffuse the conflict at its source by letting the people in these contested lands decide their own future democratically.
Exactly. It aims to provide a definitive, internationally recognized answer to the question of who do these regions belong to, based on the will of the inhabitants themselves.
Okay, so we have the political concession, the ceasefire, the buffer zone, the referenda. But what about the staggering cost of the war, the physical destruction? Ukraine will need rebuilding on a massive scale. How does the framework address that?
Through what's called the Global Reconstruction Compact. Think of it, as the sources suggest, like a modern Marshall Plan, but specifically for peace in this conflict.
A Marshall Plan for Ukraine. Who pays for it? The scale must be enormous.
It would require an unprecedented financial commitment, yes. And the funding mechanism proposed is, again, quite revolutionary because it demands broad international cooperation. It wouldn't just be the West. The plan calls for it to be jointly funded by the European Union, the United States, Russia, and key Gulf states.
Wait, Russia? Russia helps pay for the reconstruction of the country it invaded.
That's the proposal. And it's included for very specific reasons. First, it forces Russia to directly contribute to repairing the immense damage its invasion caused. It's a form of accountability, a punitive element, but framed within a collaborative structure. Second, Russia's participation gives them a tangible stake in the post-war stability and economic recovery of the region. It keeps them at the table, which is arguably necessary for long-term peace.
Okay. That makes a certain cold logic, and why the Gulf states specifically, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, are mentioned.
Their inclusion is also critical for several reasons. They have vast financial reserves, obviously, but more importantly, their participation acknowledges the global impact of this war, particularly on energy markets and food security, which directly affects them. Getting them involved as funders provides not only capital, but also helps stabilize global energy and food prices as part of the peace dividend. It also broadens the coalition beyond just the traditional Western powers in Russia.
So, a truly global effort. But massive reconstruction projects often raise concerns about corruption, especially in post-conflict situations. Are there conditions attached to this aid?
Absolutely essential conditions. Accountability is stressed as paramount. Ukraine itself, and any regions that remain part of it, would have to commit to incredibly strict transparency protocols. They'd need independent, internationally monitored anti-corruption oversight bodies to manage the funds.
To ensure the money actually rebuilds roads and hospitals, not lines pockets.
Precisely. This is non-negotiable. Western partners, and indeed the Gulf states and even Russia, would need these guarantees to sustain the political will for such massive long-term funding. Addressing corruption head-on is critical for the compact's success and legitimacy.
Okay, so this whole framework, it's incredibly detailed, it seems pragmatic, almost brutally so. It doesn't shy away from the hard concessions.
That seems to be the entire point. It tries to strip away the national pride, the historical grievances, the emotional rhetoric, and focuses ruthlessly on achievable outcomes. What can each side live with? What gives everyone a viable, face-saving way out?
And what are those pragmatic outcomes, if this whole plan were implemented?
For Russia, it offers that face-saving exit. They could potentially claim victory by having secured neutrality for Ukraine, no NATO, protected the rights or even absorbed some Russian-speaking regions via referendum, and achieved sanctions relief.
And for Ukraine?
For Ukraine, it preserves sovereignty over the majority of its territory. It secures an end to the fighting, a path to democratic renewal through elections, and crucially, access to the massive international funds needed to rebuild the country and its economy. Peace with dignity and support.
And for the rest of the world?
Stability. Stabilized energy and grain markets, a significantly reduced risk of nuclear escalation, and the end of a hugely costly and destabilizing war that has strained global resources and attention for years. A collective sigh of relief, essentially.
It's a compelling, if challenging, picture. We've laid out the mechanism, the framework. Now, let's circle back in Section 7 to the grand irony that kicked this whole deep dive off. The motivation, the prize, the triple Nobel hypothesis.
Right. This is where we connect the potential solution back to the initial absurdity. It becomes a direct challenge to Putin and Zelenskyy. The sources frame it as the if they really mean it test.
Meaning?
Meaning, if they were serious when they expressed sympathy for Trump's Nobel ambitions, if they genuinely believe he somehow deserved recognition for trying to make peace. Well, here's their chance to make it happen. Stop complaining about the 2025 snub and actually enable a peace process that could lead to a prize by committing to this framework, by sitting down at the table seriously.
Put your money where your mouth is, essentially.
Exactly. Actions, not just words about who deserved a prize last year.
And this leads to the ultimate ironic possibility, a shared Nobel Peace Prize, not just for Trump, but for all three.
That's the hypothesis, the possibility of a shared prize in, say, 2026, awarded jointly to Vladimir Putin, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, and Donald Trump, the three architects of this improbable peace.
Putin, Zelenskyy, and Trump sharing a Nobel Peace Prize. That image is almost impossible to conjure. Would the Nobel Committee ever actually do that, given the history, the animosity, the nature of the conflict?
The argument is that they might be forced to consider it based on historical precedent. This is why the hypothesis isn't just wild speculation. The Nobel Peace Prize has a history of being awarded precisely in this way to recognize former bitter enemies who chose negotiation and compromise over continued conflict.
What precedents are cited?
The classic examples are Anwar Sadat of Egypt and Menachem Begin of Israel in 1978 after the Camp David Accords, two men who had led their nations in war. Or, perhaps even more relevantly, Yitzhak Rabin, Shimon Peres of Israel, and Yasser Arafat of the PLO in 1994 for the Oslo Accords. Three figures with decades of violent conflict behind them.
So there is a model for awarding the prize to deeply opposed figures who managed to achieve a breakthrough peace deal.
Yes. A shared prize among these three. Putin, Zelenskyy, Trump, however diametrically opposed they are, would be the ultimate staggering symbol of reconciliation achieved through sheer pragmatism if they actually delivered peace via this framework.
But again, the committee seemed reluctant about Trump before. What would compel them to include him alongside Putin and Zelenskyy in 2026? What's the trigger?
Success. Verifiable success. If this comprehensive framework we've discussed, the ceasefire holds, the 50-mile withdrawal happens, the India-Nepal neutral force is successfully deployed, the referenda are held fairly and the results accepted, the Reconstruction Compact is launched if all that actually happens, and the war demonstrably ends. The Nobel Committee's hand is effectively forced.
Why forced?
Because the prize fundamentally exists to recognize the ending of major armed conflict, the achievement of peace. If these three leaders, regardless of their personal motivations or past actions, demonstrably engineer the end of Europe's largest war in decades, the committee would find it incredibly difficult not to recognize that achievement according to its own mandate. The outcome becomes undeniable.
And for Donald Trump, the man whose quest for this specific prize was the catalyst for this whole scenario.
It would be, as the analysis suggests, complete and utter vindication. His years of grievance, that feeling of being unjustly snubbed by the global elite, would be instantly erased.
The narrative flips completely.
Totally. The headline writes itself, doesn't it? Replacing the disappointment of 2025 would be, Trump wins Nobel Peace Prize for ending Ukraine war. His ego, the driving force, would be fully satisfied. He'd have achieved the ultimate legacy item he craved, proving, in his eyes and the eyes of his supporters, that he is the unparalleled dealmaker he claims to be.
The symbolism is just staggering. The idea that the very things we usually blame for conflict, personal ego, naked ambition, raw self-interest, could, in this bizarre alignment, actually converge to serve the cause of peace.
It suggests that maybe pragmatism, however messy or morally complex it feels, can sometimes triumph over intractable ideological polarization. It's not about liking the leaders or approving of their motives.
It's about the result.
It proves the point, perhaps, that you don't always need saints to end wars. You just need the right configuration of interests, pressures, and, yes, even egos, to make a deal possible. If these three polarizing, often criticized figures somehow manage to pull this off, the sheer political irony would itself be a profound statement about the nature of diplomacy.
We have covered a huge amount of ground today. From what seemed like a frankly, almost a comical geopolitical footnote, the shared Nobel complaint, to a really detailed, comprehensive, and, maybe even realistic pathway to ending the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, our deep dive today really underscores that central paradox, doesn't
Mhm.
it? That arguably the world's most dangerous, most consequential war right now could potentially be resolved not by traditional diplomats or high-minded idealists, but by this incredibly unlikely trio. The two warring leaders themselves, and a mediator whose primary motivation seems to be getting a medal.
And the final choice, as the source material puts it so starkly, it feels very clear, yet terrifyingly difficult. It's a choice between potentially a century of hostility or a generation of healing.
And the framework, the potential path, is right there. It's laid out. The decision, theoretically, is within reach. It's possible now.
The three men involved Putin, Zelenskyy, and Trump, who found that brief moment of common ground and disappointment over a prize. They now hold the key, according to this analysis, to getting their names onto history's most exclusive list, the Nobel Peace Prize laureates.
For the first time, perhaps, their individual self-interest trumps Nobel quest. Putin's need for an exit, Zelensky's need for peace and reconstruction, might actually align perfectly with what the entire world needs: an end to this devastating war.
So we have to leave you, the listener, with that final, really provocative thought that comes out of all this. We often think of political egotism, that relentless pursuit of legacy and personal validation, as one of the biggest obstacles to achieving global peace. But could it be, in this specific, extraordinary case, that the promise of the ultimate recognition of the Nobel Peace Prize itself could be weaponized? Could it be leveraged as the greatest catalyst for ending the war?
Can that sheer, unadulterated desire for personal glory actually be channeled to save potentially hundreds of thousands of lives and stabilize the world? It's a deeply uncomfortable, but maybe ultimately pragmatic question.
It's certainly a compelling thought, and a situation we will absolutely continue to track here on the Deep Dive. The world is watching to see if a deal really can be born from perhaps the strangest political alliance in modern history.